Welcome to Seakeeper's Voyages of Discovery. I'm your host, Katie Sheehan, and today we're exploring one of the most ambitious scientific missions of our time, mapping the entire ocean floor by the year 2030. Our guests are Steve Hall and Helen Snaith, two leaders from Seabed 2030, a United Nations-endorsed program working to compile a complete map of the Earth's seafloor. It's a massive international effort combining cutting-edge technology, cross-sector collaboration, and a shared belief that we can't protect what we haven't yet explored. With over 75% of the ocean floor still unmapped, the stakes are high. From tracking biodiversity and supporting marine conservation, to understanding climate change and guiding sustainable development, seafloor mapping is the foundation for ocean science and ocean survival. Seakeepers is proud to be part of this mission, equipping private vessels with bathymetric data loggers to help fill the gaps. In this episode, we'll talk about the challenges, the breakthroughs, and the discoveries that are reshaping our understanding of the planet, one depth reading at a time. Let's get mapping. So hi, Steve and Helen. Thanks so much for joining the podcast. Today, we're going to be talking about one of the most ambitious challenges in ocean science, mapping the ocean floor, and not just parts of it, but the entirety of the ocean floor. So you all are with the Nippon Foundation JEBCO Seabed 2030 initiative. And Steve, I would love to hear about your role with the initiative and what got you started with Seabed 2030.
Thanks, Katie. Yes, I'm Steve Hall. My responsibility in Seabed 2030 is all about growing our partnerships. So this is how we work with people in industry, government, academia, the third sector, volunteers, all kinds of people to try and encourage them to share their marine data into the big, rather ambitious project trying to get this first global map of the ocean. My background is not in mapping at all. I come from a mainstream kind of oceanography and policy background myself. I worked, in fact, alongside Helen for quite a few years. Maybe I won't say exactly how many. We've spent time at sea together and, had all the fun and games working on the old World Ocean Circulation experiment. Later, I moved into managing the AutoSub, Autonomous Underwater Vehicle Science Missions project, later into various types of climate work. And then I got dragged into the weird and wonderful world of marine policy from the mid-2000s, ended up heading the UK delegation to UNESCO's Intergovernmental Oceanographic Commission, and eventually was elected as vice chair of that. So I guess that was a kind of peak public sector role. And then in 2017, I escaped into the private sector. I ran the Society for Underwater Technology for a few years, later Marine Energy Wales and the Pembrokeshire Coastal Forum, and went self-employed in 2022. And quite quickly, I got snapped up by the Nippon Foundation as a contractor, really diving into that list of private sector contacts I have and public sector contacts I have to help find more partners for the Seabed 2030 project. But I'm not a real scientist. I'm more of a policy person. Helen's a real scientist, and she'll tell you all about that now.
And we'll chat about all the amazing partners and people that are helping with this initiative too. So Steve, I know that's a huge part of your role, and we'll chat a lot about those. But Helen, I'd love to know about your background and what got you involved in the Seabed 2030 project.
Like Steve, I don't have a mapping background, actually. If we go back several decades, my initial degree was in geology, so I do have a geological background, but I got into oceanography at PhD level and actually got into remote sensing. So my first initiation in seafloor mapping was actually from space-based measurements using satellite altimetry, which is our base grid that we're using now, and was a really new and exciting thing when I first started getting involved in Earth observation, but was a real kickstart for the concept that actually we needed to go and map the oceans everywhere, because it demonstrated there was a huge amount of detail that we simply hadn't recognized before. So several decades in satellite altimetry, actually looking primarily at ocean circulation, was my key research areas. but I'm a bit of a data nerd. That's my thing. If there are data involved in something, I will probably stick my nose into it. So I very quickly, in the whole Earth observation space, moved into new data sets, new data services. How do we use our data? How do we get our data to people who want to use it? That led me into the world of the British Oceanographic Data Centre, and I moved sideways within the same organisation in 2010 into the BODC. That was a bit before Seabed 2030 started kicking off. But when Seabed 2030 came along as a project, with my geology background, my interest in getting new services out there, getting data out to the public, I was selected to be the head of the Global Centre for Seabed 2030. So my input started at that point, at the initiation of the Seabed 2030 project. But BODC has been a part of GEBCO for decades. We have worked on the digital products for GEBCO since there have been digital products for GEBCO. And the history of the group here really goes back a long way in input to it. So I'm carrying on a bit of a legacy from BODC in our input in global seafloor mapping.
So that leads me very nicely to my next question of how exactly did Seabed 2030 come to fruition and when?
GEBCO itself, which is General Bathymetric Chart of the Oceans, goes back quite a long way, right back to 1903, the same year as the Wright brothers on that very, very first flight. And unlike aviation, it's taken rather a long time to get from those first steps to a fully mapped global ocean. So from 1903, this is Prince Albert I of Monaco, I think, is the correct royal. He was a individual who had a seagoing yacht, a large steam yacht, and he was able to actually go out there and make measurements himself. But more importantly, he worked with the international community to try and foster developing this first global map of the oceans. And those early maps were really very rough. The initial maps, there was only even a limited understanding that there were things like mid-ocean ridges. There were hints of it from going back to the Challenger expedition in the 1870s and this extraordinary tale of trial and error of the Victorian pioneers laying the first telegraph cables. Incredible work. They'd go and build these thousands of kilometers long cables and be draping them casually across oceans, not realizing there was a mountain range in the middle. And occasionally things would snap because they were draping it over the top of a mountain peak and it was hanging over a valley. And this drove a lot of work in trying to get much better quality surveys of the seabed. And in fact, that first edition of the GEBCO chart, going back to the early 1900s, was largely derived from people who'd been doing cable surveys so that they could find out, what the actual shape of ocean basins were. GEBCO chart evolved over many generations. Was it up to about the fifth edition? Yeah, I think was the last of the sort of the classic printed charts. These came out every few years with occasional hiccups like World War I and World War II that put substantial delays into finishing charting. But by the time we got into the 70s and 80s, there was a pretty good overview of the general shape of ocean basins, but at quite low resolution and generally only along the Great Circle routes, the places where ships tend to sail between major seaports. Because the problem always was that you needed really good depth measurements on the approaches into an anchorage, into a harbour, but once you were in water that was too deep to have any risk of running aground, unless you were doing something like laying a cable, there wasn't usually a huge amount of interest in having a very detailed map of the seabed. So we get to this point up to 2016, where it was realised that even after 113 years of effort, only 6% of the ocean had been mapped to this term we use, mapped to modern standards, and where we can go down a whole rabbit hole later on what we mean by mapped to modern standards. But essentially, there was a realization we still had 94% of the ocean essentially unmapped. And the Nippon Foundation of Japan, which is a philanthropic organization over there, stepped forward, Mr. Sasakawa, at a conference in 2016 and basically offered to fund an accelerator project, which is really what Seabed 2030 is, a project to support GEBCO, General Bathymetric Chart of the Oceans, to try and accelerate this process so that rather than taking 113 years to get to 6%, we could hopefully get much nearer to completion in just over a decade. And that is what we've tried to do. And we've managed to get it from 6% at the start of the project currently to just over 26%. And if that doesn't sound a lot, just bear in mind that even 1% of the global ocean, that's nearly 4 million square kilometres. That's the size of the whole of the European Union. So even quite small percentages are vast, vast areas. We're not apologising that we've only managed to get to 26.2% of the ocean so far. It is a vast amount that's been covered. I think it's approximately equal to the entire land mass of Africa plus North and South America that has been added to the global map since the project started in 2017.
I mean, that's huge. And I think putting it in context of land mass is a really great way to kind of convey that to people, because I think it's so easy to forget how large the ocean is. I mean, it takes up 75% of our planet. So it can be quite easy to think, oh, it's just a hop across the pond, and you're somewhere else. And so I think that metric is so nice to really put that into perspective. So Helen, I'm really curious what you see as some of the challenges are for mapping. I know we've increased this number such a huge amount and so incredible. What do we do for the rest? What are those challenges that's keeping us from the 75%?
One of the interesting things with trying to measure the seafloor is just how fundamentally difficult it is. I've said before that actually the easiest way to measure the seafloor would be to drain the oceans and then fly all of the satellite missions that we've been able to fly over the moon, over Mars, and we'd be able to map the ocean in a few days. It would be a trivial effort. The way that we map our land masses, the way that we map other planets. Unfortunately, draining the oceans really isn't a viable option for us. That means that we've got to cope with the fact that there's a lot of water in the way. The water itself gave us the method that did allow us to do the first real global maps. So the paper maps that Steve was talking about were manual interpolations, trained cartographers who had an understanding of what they expected to see in terms of shapes on the seafloor, effectively interpolating using contours between very, very sparse measurements. And that means there were huge areas of the seafloor where we had no direct measurements. And the assumption was that they were just flat, mostly, or maybe gentle slopes. As Steve said, the concept of the mid-ocean ridge was a relatively recent addition to our knowledge of the shape of the seafloor. The concept of seamounts, we knew there were places like Hawaii that there were seamounts off there, but they were not that common. We knew the ones that had islands associated with them, but really not much else. With the advent of satellite altimetry, we had a means of measuring the shape of the sea surface. And the shape of the sea surface is dominated by the shape of the seafloor. So if you have a mountain ridge on the seafloor, you have higher gravity, you've got more mass, so you have higher gravity that pulls the water towards it and gives you a bump on the sea surface. So the properties of water i.e. it flows and is able to respond to that gravity change, is why you can see the shape of the sea floor in the shape of the sea surface. So you have mounds, you have ridges, you have troughs in the shape of the sea surface. The problem is that the further away that you get from your gravity feature, the more spread out the effect is. So if you have shallow water, you can get quite a good image of that shape in the sea surface. If you have a deep water area, that shape gets smoothed out and also becomes much smaller in the sea surface. So you have this kind of natural smoothing effect according to the depth of the water. This is where the first of the global maps, the Smith and Sandwell Etopo 5 Earth topography dataset came from. This was an absolute game changer when it's arrived, because it was the first time we actually had a data point for a grid of the ocean. And it came from a real measurement. It's not a real measurement of the bathymetry, but it comes from a real measurement. And we have those everywhere. What it showed was all these big flat areas from the paper maps weren't flat at all. They all had lumps and bumps. There were sea mounts that nobody suspected were there. What we didn't know was how realistic that was. Were these just artifacts in the data? Were they real seamounts? And if they are real seamounts, are they small and flat and just a big gravity signal, or are they a small gravity signal that comes very close to the surface? There was a lot we didn't know in how to be able to interpret that information. That was actually quite a big driver for going out and measuring some of these features in reality. There were some areas where they helped to explain why we'd seen some weird things in the oceanography. Why did the ocean currents do this in this particular area? Oh, actually, when we go and look in detail at the seafloor, it's because we've got a trench in the ridge there that we didn't realize was there, and that's controlling the way that the ocean currents work. So, coinciding with that, there was a lot of development in the technology and how we actually measure the seafloor. The multi-beam bathymetric systems that were introduced at that time or a bit earlier allowed us to actually get images of the seafloor, not just a point measurement. So the single beam systems that pretty much any vessel has just give you a single point underneath your vessel, and you still have to do this interpolation. The multi-beam systems started to give us the swath. Actually, this is the shape in 2 dimensions of the seafloor, which just give us so much more detail. Wherever we go, they fill in the detail in that kind of fuzzy map that we get from the satellite altimetry. So if we want to go back to fundamentals, why is it so difficult to fill in the guess? It's the water. It's the water that gets in the way. It does not transmit. All of those nice space-based systems bounce off the surface. They don't go down through the water. The sonar systems are what we need to get to the seafloor. That means you've got to have vessels on or under the surface to be able to measure. That just means so much ship time and ship time costs. So then we start bringing in the new technologies, things that can be run all the time on vessels, even if you're not specifically measuring that. The more automated type platforms that are now starting to come out. So the automated surface vehicles that can actually run without people aboard. It's that capacity which is still our limiting factor. It still needs a lot of time for something in the water to be able to make the measurements, whether that's a vessel on the surface, whether that's an unmanned vessel. It's a lot of time in the water making the measurements.
Yeah, and I hope we can scale up and get there someday. And I really want to talk more about the technology, but I have to ask Steve a question first. Steve, why do we care about bathymetry, mapping the ocean floor? Let's get into that first before we get into all the nitty gritty. Why do we care?
No, it's a very good question, Katie, and it's one of the reasons why it's taken such a long time to deliver a global map of the ocean. Nation states are really, really interested in what's happening within their own waters. So that first 200 nautical miles or so off the coast, people need to know for homeland security, for access to resources. They might be doing oil and gas work or laying pipelines. They might be doing fisheries, all kinds of reasons why people want to know what's happening in their own 200 miles. Once you get beyond 200 miles, you're kind of into the Wild West. You're into this area of areas beyond national jurisdiction, and essentially who pays. This has always been the issue. We still need to know what's happening in those areas. As Helen said, the shape of the seafloor, it determines which way currents flow, it determines which way nutrients flow, pollution, all kinds of particles. You put anything into the ocean, it could end up the other side of the planet at some point because it is all interconnected. And the shape of the seabed absolutely constrains how that water flows. It has implications in terms of resources. It has implications in terms of, for example, if you're a small island state in a place that's prone to tsunamis, the shape of the seabed will channel how that tsunami flows, and it will make a real life or death difference to just how high that wave will be when it hits that local shoreline. If you're a country that isn't wealthy enough to afford its own survey ships, how can you know how to manage the resources that sit within your own waters, even that 200 miles, that critical piece that countries are interested in? It tends to only be the wealthiest nations that are able to go out there and map what's down in their own seabed. Sometimes they might want to know what's down there just to stop somebody else exploiting it as well. That happens where a country puts up a great big ban to say, right, you're not allowed in here because we know we have this and we don't particularly want an advanced first world nation turning up and trashing our little piece of seabed. And also maps level the playing field as well, because at the moment, if you are a wealthy industrialized nation and you want to go out there and exploit submarine resources, you have the technology, you have the capability to go out there and find out what's happening. If you're a less developed nation that hasn't got that resource, you've just got a big blank sheet of paper telling you what's down there on your seabed. And by projects like GEBCO, like Seabed 2030, delivering a global map which is free for all users wherever they are, it gives equal access. It democratizes access to the ocean. In the same way, if you or I, had a large plot of land or we owned an island somewhere, and we couldn't really figure out what we were going to do with it. We wouldn't know where to put the roads. We wouldn't know where to put the power lines. We wouldn't know where to build the towns and villages if we didn't have a map. It's almost fundamental. And for the seabed, it's much the same. Without maps, how can you manage what you haven't measured? So it's essentially all about is making sure that people have access to a global map that tells them what's down there, to know what they need to protect, to know what they need to conserve, to know what they might be able to safely exploit. And there are lots of questions still being asked about what are the resources that we should and shouldn't use on the seafloor. And you need those maps for people to make informed decisions about how they decide to use the resources that are around them. So lots of good reasons. And I'm sure without me going on waffling for a while, I could probably think of a few more.
No, that's amazing. It sounds like such a beneficial tool to not just know how deep the ocean is, but in some cases to actually know what is down there. And that comes into the different technologies that are used. So, Helen, I'd love to get into this a little bit and learn more exactly how you all retrieve data, this depth data from the ocean, where it goes, what type of format it's in, and yeah, these differences between maybe the single beams you were talking about versus being able to characterize whether the seafloor in that area is coral or seagrass or just sand. all of those intricacies?
There's a lot wrapped up in that question. Seabed 2030 is predominantly, we are interested in the bathymetry. We are interested in the shape of the seafloor. But if we move away from those areas that we were mentioning earlier, close to ports on main traffic routes, the shape of the seafloor itself is not that interesting. It's what that means for what you can do. So is it steep topography? In which case, you probably don't want to lay your cable over it, for example. But the counter side of that is that might be a really interesting place to go and look for marine life, for different ecosystems that we don't understand at the moment. The bathymetry is very much the first port of call to actually know what you might find somewhere. So away from those port areas where people are doing the surveys because they need to know, is it safe to be able to travel in these areas? The majority of the data that we incorporate in the deep ocean, in more remote parts of the world, comes from research surveys. It comes from people who are carrying out research in particular areas. That research may not be to find the bathymetry, but before they can do anything else, they have to go and do that bathymetry survey to help them understand where to be able to target their other measurements. For example, if you are laying current meter mooring, you want to understand what the bathymetry is around that mooring so you can understand how the current flows are expected to flow past your mooring. The difference between putting your mooring right on the edge of a shelf or a steep slope and putting it in the middle of an abyssal plain, one of the few actual flat areas in the middle of the ocean, will fundamentally change how you interpret your current meter data when you get it back. So it's the research cruises that are really driving where we're getting data back from at the moment. So this 20% extra that Steve was mentioning earlier that we've had since the start of the program, a lot of that has come from research cruises. People have gone out to investigate something in the ocean. The bathymetry may come as a key part of their measurement, and it may just be something that they had to measure before they could start doing anything else. So the technologies that we use for it, the single beam system, it's a really, really simple principle, and bats have been using it for a really very, very long time. You send out a sound signal, you determine how long that sound signal takes to get back to you, and that's directly related to the distance that your sound signal has travelled. It's a single ping, you wait for the ping back, you know how deep it is. One ping Vasily from Red October is coming through my head at this point here. So what it gives you is a repeated single ping to the seafloor, back up again. The ship's moved forward a little bit. You get a ping, you get a measurement from the next bit. So as long as you know where your vessel is and you know that you're pointing straight down, you've got a depth, you've got a position. There are corrections that need to be put in place because there is not a single velocity of sound in water. It will depend on the exact density profile of the water that it's going through. But it's a very simple principle. It's a pretty simple calculation. The big advance was when we went to these multi-beam systems. And the way that they work is instead of a single ping, they transmit the downward sound in a set of bins, what we call them, which give you a scan of the seafloor. So instead of a single point directly below the vessel, your sonar is running in a line perpendicular to the way that your vessel is running. Just as with a single beam data set, your ship's moving forward. So when you take your next ping, it's another line a bit further forward. You move forward again, you get another line. So you're measuring multiple different values, some of which are out at an angle. So you're still measuring immediately below the vessel, and that's how much water you've got under your keel, which is what a lot of vessels reduce it down to and go, that's my single most important thing. But you have all these other measurements at a slight sideward angle from the vessel. The processing of that obviously gets more complicated because you need to be able to correct it for the slant that you've got on the system. You also have to convert your measurement in terms of where am I actually measuring on the seafloor? Because the deeper your water, the further away from the vessel the outside of your beam comes back from, and the bigger each footprint is on the seafloor. So if you're in very shallow water, you will have a very narrow beam because it hasn't spread out very much as it's left the vessel. So your swath that you're actually measuring will only be very narrow, and each little pixel that you're getting a return from, each footprint on the seafloor, is going to be quite small. You might be talking about 10 meters squared or even smaller than that for some of the newer systems with very high resolution. When you go out into open water and you're going into 4,000 meters of water, the first thing is that you need more energy in your system because it's got to be able to penetrate all that water to the seafloor. So then use more energy, and you still only get quite a small signal back again. A lot of it bounces away and away from your vessel, so you don't actually get the signal back. But you're also, each footprint on the seafloor is going to be much bigger. And typically for most open ocean, for the typical multi-beam systems that we have on research vessels, it's about 400 meters. So every 400 meters in a box underneath the vessel, you get a signal back up again. And that's fundamentally what sets the resolution that we're trying to achieve when it comes to mapping. It's based on this, what can we actually achieve given a typical system? There are a number of technology advances that are coming on that are really helping us. The autonomous surface vehicles is a big step forward because we don't have to send vessels with people out. We can use much smaller vessels. Technology improvement in the energy efficiency of the systems. So you still need to put the same amount of energy into your beam, but it actually takes less energy to be able to drive it. That makes some of these autonomous systems much more practical. Increasingly, we're starting to put multi-beam systems onto subsurface systems, so gliders and autonomous underwater vehicles that fly below the surface and maybe a fixed distance above the seafloor. What this actually gives us is much higher resolution data in open ocean than we could ever achieve from a vessel. So they don't necessarily give us better coverage in terms of trying to produce the global map, but where we do have it, we have much higher resolution. So they're significant step forwards in those areas. One of the other really big step forward is actually in satellite-derived bathymetry. So when you're in relatively shallow water, and typically we're talking less than 30 meters and quite often less than 10 meters, you can use ocean color to help you determine the seafloor bathymetry. It's a very interesting concept, and it's based on the fact that different wavelengths of light are absorbed by water at different rates. So the reason that the sea looks blue is that blue light penetrates the water and comes back. Red light is absorbed much more quickly. And you go through the spectrum and you get this absorption spectrum for all the different colors. So if you can measure the color of the water and your water is mostly clear, you can use the different return in different wavelengths of light to determine how deep the seafloor is. It's more complicated than that because obviously if your seafloor is a different color, then it's going to be reflecting differently. But that then brings in one of your other questions, which is, how do you find out about what's actually on the seafloor? Can you find out more scientifically? And that process can also help you identify things like seagrass beds. You can use the same data set to do bathymetry and identify what's on the seafloor. So it's a very powerful technique. As I said, it is limited by the depth of the water. You have to be able to see the bottom. So if you were driving over in a boat and you look down, you'd have to be able to see the bottom for it to work. So the North Sea, not a great test site for this. You can't really see the bottom, even if you're paddling at the seashore. Very, very good for many of the island nations where you have clear water, but a lot of really shallow water that it's very difficult to get a boat into. It's too shallow. It's not safe to send people in, even if you had the resource to send vessels in. And we have some fantastic data sets been added in the last few years from satellite-derived bathymetry that have really increased our knowledge around some of the smaller islands, atolls in particular, around the world. And it's been a huge, huge increase in the amount of data that we have.
Yeah, that's quite a success story. And it's amazing all the innovative ways there are to map the ocean floor and all the other science or data metrics that can come with that. So it really sounds like bathymetry is the blueprint for ocean science. We need that before we can do much else to really work on protecting our oceans.
There's a really fundamental issue with bathymetry. If you asked anybody who was doing land-based studies to go to an area and find out what's the land cover usage, what's the effect of plant life, what's the ecology in this area, they wouldn't dream of doing that without looking at a map first to see what the topography looks like. Have I got hills? Have I got rivers? Have I got valleys? Have I got steep slopes? Have I got flat land? But that's exactly what we have to do in the open ocean because we don't have that map at the moment. And we need that to be able to even know where the most important places are. 30 by 30 is trying to get 30% of our oceans protected by 2030. We really don't know what that 30% should be. Where are the most important areas? Without the map, we can't do that. And off the back of the map, then you can start looking at now we've got our target areas. These look like they might be interesting. Then you can go and use the other research techniques to look at the ecology, look at the geology, look at what are the interesting features down there. One of the areas that the seafloor bathymetry and the seafloor surveys are being used is to target those kind of ecological surveys. Where are we likely to find the deep water corals that we know are rare and are very interesting? We know the kind of seafloor that they like to have, but we don't know where that is until we've gone and got the map.
Steve, can you tell us about some of the people, communities, and organizations that are putting in the work to contribute data to this map and hopefully accelerating you all towards the goal of mapping 100% by 2030?
Yes, certainly. We've got some really key industry partners in this project. In no particular order of merit, you could start with, on the one hand, big multinational offshore survey companies like Fugro, who operate fleets of research vessels and purpose-built survey ships and robots that historically were supporting the development of things like laying pipelines, laying cables, installing offshore infrastructure for oil and gas and wind farms and this kind of thing. So you could say that almost they're the top tier survey companies, the kind of people that can deliver hundreds of square kilometers, but with one major proviso, and that is if you are a survey company, the data belongs to the client. It doesn't belong to the survey company. They've been paid by the client, so it might be, Chevron or BP or something like that will have given them a contract to say, can you survey this area where we'd perhaps like to install some oil and gas platforms? Now, Fugro can't just casually turn up to Seabed 2030 and say, hey, here's the survey. It's not theirs. to give us. So one of the key things that we have to do is work with the clients as well as the survey company. So we'll go to the company and say, Fugro have done this fantastic job. They've surveyed this area. Would you be willing to donate a portion or a subsample of that survey to Seabed 2030? And quite often companies do. Not always, but quite often they do. More helpfully, and certainly faster for us, the survey companies do own the data they gather when they're en route. So between the point where they leave the harbour and when they start doing the offshore survey, if they leave the swath bathymetry multi-beam system on while they're in transit, they end up developing a really useful seabed survey data set of the route between the 2 points, and they are at liberty to donate that to us straight away. And again, they often do. So that's your kind of top tier of companies that donate data. The next level is actually the equipment manufacturers. So companies like Kongsberg, who tend to be among the market leaders in building the echo sounders of various kinds, everything from simple single ping type systems right through to complex multi-beam systems. They actually now add into their hardware and into the software for the echo sounders they fitted to the survey ships the ability to donate data directly to Seabed 2030. So if you've got a complex Kongsberg top-end system, there is literally a button on the system that will be donate data, and this will get squirted down the line on when the ship returns to harbour, straight to the system. Now, that doesn't happen a lot, but the system does exist, and other manufacturers are incorporating similar things into there. The next layer after industry tends to be governments. Obviously, most nations, for historical reasons, hydrographic survey tends to sit within their departments of defence. Historically, seabed mapping tended to be part of national security and safety of navigation. So in the UK, you have the UK Hydrographic Office is still part or closely associated with the Ministry of Defence, and very similar in other developed nations as well, same in France and the United States and other countries. So defence departments tend to own a lot of the hydrographic survey data. If the data isn't sensitive for national security purposes, it will be donated into the system. Not necessarily the highest resolution down to the nearest centimetre figure. We certainly don't want to give away data that might show exactly where a sensitive cable is, or exactly where a sensitive pipeline is, or exactly where a critical piece of subsea infrastructure connecting, oil and gas pipelines together is. We don't necessarily want that in the public domain for unfortunate reasons. But what we will do is accept a data set that's been slightly degraded so that you don't show the sensitive features, but you've got the things that will show where the hills and valleys are. So you've got your industry at the top, then you get the government surveys, you then get the smaller scale surveys, often been done by professional scientists, by universities, by research labs, sending individual research ships and robots out there to do surveys over perhaps a more limited area, but often to very high resolution. So if you're going to an area of scientific interest, we call it mowing the lawn, which does kind of sum up what a seabed survey is like. And you tend to find in both commercial surveys and in quite a few of the scientific surveys that mesh of measurements can be very dense indeed, particularly as you're trying to measure some very, very small features. As Helen pointed out, one of the problems we get with all of these data donations is as the water gets deeper, the fan-shaped beam of sound gets wider, so you do tend to lose some resolution as you get into deeper waters. That's not a problem for Seabed 2030 because we're only trying to produce a fairly low resolution map. But as we saw with the companies that were trying to hunt for the wreck of the lost airliner MH370 a few years ago, by the time you get down to multi-thousand meter depths, the beam of sound, the resolution can be larger than the length of the fuselage of the plane you're looking for. So if you're trying to find a fuselage which is less than 100 meters long, but the pixels, so to speak, that are coming back from the survey are bigger than 100 meters. You're not going to find the plane. So you have to go back and forth, and resurvey the same area with a lot of overlap so that you can pick out those small features. And that can make it a very slow process. Again, not necessarily what we're trying to do for Seabed 2030 purposes, but if you are trying to produce a very high resolution map, it does become a very time-consuming process. Now, after you've had your governments and you've had industry and you've had your academics going out there, the next and incredibly important layer of data tends to come from citizen science and crowdsourced bathymetry of various kinds. And this is certainly where organizations like your own, the Seakeepers, comes in, because you go to places where big survey ships don't. You have the individuals or the companies that own the vessels that fit into the Seakeepers community. They'll be visiting places where perhaps the water is too shallow to send a large survey vessel into, or it might be an area that has very limited commercial interest, so it hasn't attracted an industry surveyor to go in there. It might be a place where nobody's trying to lay cables or lay pipelines or build secret underwater bases to hide their submarines or anything like this. So for those reasons, it becomes an incredibly important part of this jigsaw, filling in the missing pieces. It might only be a small percentage of the total ocean you're measuring, but you're measuring it from places that otherwise might not get measured at all. And we've even had instances of individuals literally with stand-up paddleboards going into places like mangroves and some of these swampy coastal areas. And there's certainly one instance I'm aware of, literally with a good old-fashioned weighted line, taking measurements of how deep the water was, just like they used to do back in the days of Captain Cook and La Perouse. The most simple and fundamental seabed survey of all, the pointy stick or the weighted rope, provided you've got a good position fix, that's still really, really useful data. And you may be adding something to a map that nobody had ever measured before. So there's an opportunity for everything from citizen scientist in her kayak right through to a high net worth individual with a super yacht, filling in some very, very important gaps in knowledge that we may not otherwise gather in the normal way through the use of survey ships and robots.
It takes everyone, it sounds like. We need everyone at all different levels, from providing those large swaths of high-res data to the little gaps that, maybe private vessels can do. And a question I get a lot from the Seakeepers citizen science vessels that have loggers and are collecting data for Seabed 2030, they often get concerned because their depth transducers in their vessels don't go very deep. So they can really only get that coastal data. What would you say to someone who has concerns that, maybe traveling the same coastal areas wouldn't be valuable?
I think that this is one that is really important for us. When I mentioned earlier, and Steve's mentioned as well, the issue with the resolution of the data, but the swath width is also important. As you get into very shallow water, your swath from a multi-beam is very narrow. So actually, your survey has to be very, very tight to be able to get a complete survey, which means actually the small percentage of the water that is less than 100 meters would take more time to survey in total than the deep water, which is 80% of our global ocean map. You need to do such a fine survey. So we need a lot of people to be going into those shallow areas and taking measurements. And from the crowdsourced bathymetry in particular, we don't necessarily know the quality of the measurement that we're getting. We don't know how good the system is that's being used. I mentioned earlier about needing to put corrections in for the water density and exactly what depth your system is. Is it at the surface? Is it on the keel of your boat? That kind of issue. If we get lots of measurements all in the same area, those kinds of errors all get managed out of the system. If we only have one value, that's still really important because it's probably the only value that you've got. So if you don't know if your water is 10 meters deep or 50 meters deep, one measurement is very, very helpful. If you do know that it's about 15 meters deep, but you get lots and lots of measurements, you go, oh, yeah, actually, it's 14 meters. So when you go from an area that's not mapped at all to an area that's actually mapped, we've got quite a few measurements in it. Getting more and more measurements just helps to increase the quality of the data that we have in those particular areas. So it's very important that we get lots of data in that shallow water. Yes, it would be great if all the systems had, systems that would reach down to 4,000 meters, and every time we got a yacht that did a transatlantic run, we'd got a nice trace. But even if we just get that shallow section of it, they're likely to be running across an area that nobody else has actually run on. We've got new data. So it's all incredibly valuable.
That's so interesting. And it sounds like we just need as many people out on the water taking measurements as possible, even in the areas where we do have bathymetric measurements.
Yeah, and also don't forget in some of those very dynamic coastal areas, things change rapidly. If you're working in an area where there are sandbanks and features like that, some of these things can change almost from tide to tide. And certainly they will change over a period of weeks and months. And a recreational user may be able to go in and measure things certainly on a time frequency, which is much more frequent than any commercial survey or big military survey is ever likely to do. So there's definitely a space for all users, plenty of opportunities for citizen science here.
I love that everyone has a spot at the table to contribute to this project, even if you're just on a paddleboard. That's a really cool story. So I'd love to know if there's been any surprising or interesting discoveries from the data that's been collected through Seabed 2030.
There's been some quite novel bits of information that have come in. One of our most interesting data sets is from marine mammal diving data. So we actually have a small data set where marine mammals have been tagged to understand their feeding processes. But obviously, as part of that process, they also record the temperature, the salinity, and the depth during the profile. So for those mammals that are actually sea bottom feeders, they're going down and feeding stuff, the maximum depth of every dive gives you the depth of the seafloor at that point. And we have been investigating how we make use of those data. So we're attracting a whole range of people. You mentioned, there's a space for everybody at the table, but there's also a whole range of systems out there where depth is one of the parameters that's measured as part of other research. And we've gained that momentum now. People have heard of us. People know we're interested in the data, and they're getting in touch with us to give us those data. Before, it would have just sat there. There wasn't a home for it. That's one of our more interesting data sets. In terms of discoveries, because the priority for Seabed 2030 is producing this global map, which is kind of coarse resolution, the discoveries aren't coming from our map per se, but there is mapping going on partly because of the incentive of getting the data into Seabed 2030. And that's where the exciting discoveries are coming from. There was some excellent work carried out by the Falcor 2 in 23 and 24. And they actually went out to investigate some of the potential seamount areas. So it's areas where there was an indication from the satellite altimeter data that there was probably something here. There was something interesting that it was worth going out to map. What they actually found was 4 seamounts that had not previously been mapped. And the biggest of these was nearly 2.5 kilometers high from seafloor to the top of the mountain. We're not talking small features here. We're talking massive features
Giants hidden under the ocean.
Yeah, features that come within 1,000 meters of the surface. These are pretty significant. They're going to have impact on biological distribution. They're going to have impact on currents. These are really quite big discoveries. On the opposite scale, there has been a lot of work been done in the Arctic and in particular around Greenland. And as a result, unfortunately, as a result of some of the ice melting on Greenland, there's areas in northern Greenland where we haven't been able to map before, where we've had survey vessels going in, and they've been able to map some fascinating features as a result of the ice scour and the flow of the ice and water through these small fjords in northern Greenland. So there's some brilliant research coming out of that research. And the driver for a lot of that collection is improving the bathymetry, improving our understanding. And I guess one of the most dramatic surveys was around Tonga after the explosion. And I'm afraid I am not even going to attempt to pronounce the name of the volcano that went off. But there were survey data before the explosion, but we were able directly through Seabed 2030 and additional funding from the Nippon Foundation to go out and map the area almost immediately after the explosion to understand what had actually happened. And the difference between the mapping before and afterwards helped us to understand what actually happened to the material that was blown up, basically. Yeah. So quite a lot of it obviously went up into the atmosphere. There were big clouds of smoke that came up from the volcano, but there were massive underwater slides, and these have been mapped. So we can see where the hole is on the side of the volcano, where the material came from. We can see the scour of that flow down the volcano. We can see where it ended up. And that was the cause of most of the damage to the cables from the volcano. It wasn't the volcano going up itself. It was the flows and the violence of that. And understanding those processes then helps support those economies. Where to not put your cables in future is one of the examples, how to make them more resilient to those kind of actions in the future. So, real economic benefit for some areas. But yeah, I guess that's probably one of the most dramatic bits of work that's come out of Seabed 2030.
Those were all such amazing examples. I still can't get over the cetaceans doing bathymetric measurements. That might be one of the coolest things I've ever heard.
I think mainly seal tags, seals and walruses, I think were our...
And turtles as well. I've heard of people using turtles. Citizen scientists don't have to be human. It's a very important message.
Oh, that's amazing.
And what Helen said is that thousands of seamounts that literally were not on any charts at all have certainly been found in the surveys that have been donated to Seabed 2030, and areas on seabed maps that were thought to be just rather flat, boring abyssal plains and not a lot happening turn out to contain hundreds of almost completely uncharted mountains. The flip side of that being, of course, that when you reveal where they all are, it can mean that people will turn up and start trying to trawl them, which isn't necessarily what we want. But that is, again, the human element of what the maps leads to. And this is a decision that is for citizens, for governments, for communities to make informed decisions about how they use the seabed based on having that data, rather than just having somebody that wants to go out there and trawl a seamount who's able to go out there, perhaps do their own little private map that they don't share with anybody, go do the damage and nobody even knows that the thing existed. Or perhaps they turn up several years later and find out it's been fished to oblivion, whereas had the map been available for all users in the past, there might have been an opportunity to monitor it and decide what the safe fishing limits might be for that area.
Yeah, that's always such an interesting caveat for open source databases, but I still think it's what we were talking about earlier. Bathymetry is the blueprint for ocean sciences in general. So we have to hope that it will be used for the greater good and to further science and innovation and protecting our oceans, protecting our coastal communities. So I'm curious where people can find the bathymetric globe that you all have been working on.
All of our data is available through JEBCO, through the JEBCO website. If you go to jebco.net, you'll find a big button that says access our data. That will take you to options as to how to either download the data or to visualize the data. We also have a fantastic visualization system that has been built in support of Seabed 2030. And if you go to the Seabed 2030 website, seabed2030.org, you'll see on the front page a direct link. And in fact, on the front page, you can visualize the data set, the global grid, and play with it, zoom in, zoom out, spin the world, find your favorite part of the world, and see what the bathymetry looks like. So it's all directly available for you to click and access, or just play with if you just want to see what's available.
I love that tool. I feel fortunate enough that I was at a conference in March that Helen, you and Steve from Seabed 2030 were attending, and you had what you called the bathysphere. Is that what you were calling it?
We have two things. The online tool that we have is called the Bathy Globe, and that's a purely software tool, so anybody can access that within their browser. But we have a physical globe, which I think we call the bathysphere, which is slightly odd because a bathysphere is something different. A bathysphere is something that goes down to great depths. It's like a submarine with a very specific shape. But it's a big physical globe that has a projection of the bathymetry on it and is interactive. So you can spin the globe just by touching it. You can zoom in on areas of it. And we have information linked to touch points on that globe. So you can find out more about specific areas by interacting with it. Clearly, the two things have different audiences. One is available to everybody from everywhere. So as something that anybody can go and have a look at. Our interactive bathysphere is a fantastic tool to allow people to interact and discuss if they have an opportunity to get where it is. But clearly, there's only ever going to be a very limited number of people who are going to be able to physically get to the place where that is. But it is an amazing, amazing tool.
We do take it on the road as well occasionally. And I suspect we better make an alteration to our website at some point to tell people here is where you can see the bathysphere in action. It will certainly be traveling to Vancouver later in the year. I believe it will be in Rio at the tail end of COP30 as well. It will certainly be in Nice during the UN Ocean conference that's happening, but I think that is before this episode is likely to be broadcast. Yeah, we'll make sure we put something on the website that shows people want to see the bathysphere. Here is where it will next be. And we're not just keeping it in Europe. It is out and about.
I mean, that's a great idea, bringing it around to the conferences you go to. And then I was playing around with, the 2D version online, the software, and that's fascinating. Helen, you were showing me where those surveys for the flight that went down were, and I could see that on this map too. It was really fun to have seen the globe in person and then get to go and see the same thing accessible to anyone on your website. So that is a fantastic tool that I recommend to anyone to just go explore and learn more about our planet.
The MH370 is search data is another, I think, really big success story for us, in that it was one of the first events, one of the first time periods where we got the transit data from all of the survey vessels that were included in that search. And they made a conscious effort to not take the same route to and from the survey site each time. So as you will have seen when you were playing with the bathysphere, there is a concentrated, very high resolution data set actually along the projected path of MH370, which is the data that they were actually collecting and being paid to survey for. But we have at least the same area coverage of bathymetry data from all of the survey transects going to and from that survey site. Those would not normally have been collected if it hadn't been for Seabed 2030 and the initiative to increase the amount of data that's available. We wouldn't have that. And that's given us a huge additional input to the global grid. which was a massive success for us.
Well, this has been such a lovely conversation. It sounds like I might be seeing you all at the United Nations Ocean Conference pretty soon in June, and then hopefully again throughout the year. So I'm really curious, Steve, what's next for Seabed 2030?
There's obviously a lot of ocean still to do. Whatever happens to Seabed 2030 at the end of its funding period, GEBCO carries on. The General Bathymetric Chart of the Ocean will continue until the task is finished. We'll know at some point in the next year or so whether we're funded to carry on to the next phase of Seabed 2030, whether we'll still call it Seabed 2030 or Seabed Beyond 2030 or Seabed 100% or whatever we want to call it. That will be a decision for our funding agency. And I should again give a big thank you to the Nippon Foundation for paying for this project. They don't pay for people to go out there to make the maps, but what they do is pay for this community to be available to gather the data and feed it into the global data center so that we're all able to access what's being learned about. And without that funding, it might happen, but it would take a very, very long time. It's a big planet.
It is, but we have a lot of people working towards a common goal. So I'm keeping my fingers crossed for you all. Hopefully, I like the Seabed 100% idea. That sounds great. We'll get as many people as we can involved in reaching that mission.
I hope I live long enough to see the same thing being done on the other places in the solar system that have oceans. We know there's an ocean under the ice of Jupiter's moon Europa. There are liquid hydrocarbon oceans on Titan. There are oceans probably on Enceladus and other moons too. And one of the things that really excites me about what we do on Seabed 2030 and GEBCO is the techniques, the technologies, especially the robotics technologies that we're developing to map the unknown places in our own world, particularly when you get under ice caps and all of those things. We'll be using those, or our children or our grandchildren will be using those technologies to map other worlds not that far in the future. There will be listeners to this podcast who will witness that, who will see the first seabed maps of Europa within their lifetime. And it will be using the same technologies, the same techniques, alas, probably not citizen scientists, and almost certainly not turtles or cetaceans, but who knows, maybe there's something under the ice in Europa and they'll be able to carry gadgets for us as well.
Well, this is amazing. You all aren't just progressing Earth innovation and exploration, but potentially interstellar exploration and discovery. It's a very fascinating application, and I am so excited to see where this project goes for you all. I hope Seakeepers can keep contributing in any small way we can, and I hope to see that map filling up.
Thank you, Katie.
Thanks, Katie. Thanks for the opportunity to speak to you.
Thanks for tuning in to this episode of Seakeepers Voyages of Discovery. Join us next time as we set sail to the Galapagos Marine Reserve to uncover stories from the front lines of wildlife conservation and ocean exploration. Until then, fair winds and following seas.